And I was asked by Jenny Clark, who's preaching this morning, to introduce Monford this morning in his class for leading us through the Old Testament and the various themes and sort of his own scholarship and work as a professor for many years. So we're very grateful to have you here for the next few weeks and sharing your gift and your knowledge and walking this class through this just wonderful topic of the Bible. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Those who are watching, can you hear me on Zoom?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yes.
All right. It's. I think I'm going to take this off. Is that okay? Yes. Good to be with you again.
Whatever you say.
I did a series with this class about a year ago, I think a year and a half ago, on the nature of Scripture, inspiration, authority, and so on and so forth, in relationship to the Presbyterian official statement about Scripture and how, generally speaking, most folks in the Presbyterian context understand the nature of Scripture and inspiration and how it is our authoritative word for guiding us as followers of Jesus, living our lives in this world. This time, for the 5 weeks that start today, you have all received, I think, a handout. Well, you have a handout in front of you that is basically an outline of what I'm covering today. Today's introduction. I told my friend Sally Brown, who's been here and doing some work with you all, that today is kind of bread and butter stuff, basic historical survey of the literature in the Old Testament, the historical context, the geography, and all of that. Next week, we get into the fun stuff. And I think you all have seen, those of you who are watching the announcement that has come several times over the last few weeks about the 5 different topics of the series. So, and the title here is Encountering the Old Testament, but I almost prefer the double topic, engaging the Old Testament and being engaged by it. Okay, that's all included in what I call encountering the Old Testament. So we will do that. We will talk about the beginning today, and then next week we will deal with cultural, social, historical context of the Old Testament. And that's a very interesting, it's also a topic that's way beyond what we can do in one session. But we're going to hit some of the highlights because we have to recognize that the life of Israel took place in the context of a larger and Near Eastern Semitic world and culture. And Israel, in its various phases, living through that 1500, 2000 year period, were influenced by and also stood over against aspects of that culture. And it shows up in the documents that we know as the Old Testament. And then we are going to go on and talk about what I call the problem of the Old Testament. That is, there are a lot of things in the Old Testament that Christians from the very beginning, the first Christian century, have found difficult, sometimes objectionable, sometimes in total tension with or contradiction of affirmations that have been made about God in the Old Testament. So we'll take a look at that, the problem of the Old Testament. After that, I'm going to rehabilitate the Old Testament with the topic, the Old Testament is indispensable for Christian faith and life. And then the final session, what I call the God of the Old Testament. very often in popular Christian understanding, the God of the Old Testament has been understood the God of law and judgment, and the God of the New Testament as the God of love and compassion. That just ain't so. The God revealed in Jesus Christ is the God of the Old Testament. The reality is that in that long period of its history, there were places and times when Israel or certain aspects of Israel's community misunderstood God and saw him and experienced God in ways that later documents, even in the Old Testament, for example, the prophets, critiqued some of the things that were earlier understood to be, in fact, coming directly from God. So that's a very, very important kind of topic. So, given that introduction, we will go to this part one. The Old Testament historical framework. This is the overview. And by the way, there are times when I'm going to ask you some questions to respond. People on Zoom can also participate in that. In the next few sessions, there are going to be more opportunities. We're going to have some discussions in little quads or trinities. Keep people together. Okay. This is it's a little blurry. I tried to find a better map, but this is we start Israel's story. You have the early chapters of Genesis, which are what some scholars have called prehistory. The creation story is not history as such. It's the beginning of everything. It's a theological affirmation and statement. You really get to the beginning of Israel's history with the life of Abraham. Later becomes Abraham. Okay? In Genesis chapter 11 and 12 and 13, that's where the story starts. And this is a map of the ancient Near East, which gives you an idea of the migration of Abraham, which began in Ur of the Chaldees until he came up to Haran. Oh, I don't want that. It'll disappear, I guess. I hope it disappears. It was up in Haran, in the northern part of what we now know as the land of Canaan or Palestine, where Abraham, according to Genesis 12:1 and following, received the calling from God. I will take you into a new land, the land of Canaan, and I will make you a great nation, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's the beginning of the story of Israel. And so Abraham with his family, and Abraham, as well as most of the other descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob's 12 sons and so on, were nomads. They were not agricultural people like the Canaanites and the Philistines. And that created some problems later on after the Exodus, when the Israelites settled in the land of Canaan. They were nomads, and they moved with their herds to different grazing areas. And that often created conflict and tension with people who were also living in those areas and also nomads, okay? So they meandered down through the land. The Philistines are in this lower area of the Mediterranean coast here, and moved down all the way into Negev, which is the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula, which is this thing down here. between the Persian Sea and the Red Sea, and even to the place where Abraham and Sarai, his wife, had an encounter with the Pharaoh of Egypt. And then they moved back out of Egypt into this area where the rest of Abraham's life and the beginning of his descendants takes place. So that's kind of the geographical historical context. Okay, we're talking about a 2,000-year history. A 2,000-year history in which what we now know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, then later translated into Greek, had its origin. It's a long period. From 2000 to 1600, we have the story of the patriarchs. That's primarily recorded for us in the book of Genesis. From Abraham all the way until we find the people of Israel in slavery in Egypt. The 12 sons of Jacob and their descendants living in Egypt in servitude. Israel's enslavement from Egypt has to be dated somewhere between 1600 and 1450 before the Common Era, or before BC, before Christ. That's a terminology that's used these days. We used to say BC, before Christ, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, after Christ. Because of our diverse community, but not everybody is a Christian, and scholars have determined that we should call it before the Common Era, BCE, and CE, Common Era. In my head, I still translate that as before the Christian era, and that's right. My head, because in my heart, I'm a Christian person. But in the larger academic and literary community, they use it before the Common Era because different peoples had different calendars. The Romans and the Greeks had different calendars. They didn't always line up. And so the Common Era really begins with the Christian era. Okay, so 1640. By the way, these dates are, the closer we get to the New Testament, the more exact and precise the dates become. In the early centuries, the dates are very flexible. You can sometimes have a difference between 200 and 500 years. Okay, so a lot of archaeology, a lot of documents have been discovered through archaeological finds and literary analysis that give us a pretty good idea of the general historical flow. That is the context for the Old Testament. Israel's enslavement in Egypt takes place during approximately, as you can see, about 150 years, 1600 to 1450. And then from 1450 to 1400 is generally the chronological context within which the work of Moses, the Exodus, and the sojourn in wilderness takes place. And it is in this period that we have the beginnings of the collections of some of the documents that we have in the Old Testament, especially the book of Deuteronomy, which is usually dated toward the close of the Mosaic period. And during the wilderness, the sojourn in the wilderness, the book of Numbers and the book of Leviticus are the two major documents that emerge out of that historical setting. the sojourn in the wilderness. Then from 1400 to 1050, in that period, we have the conquest of Canaan in the early part of the 14th century BC, the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, and the dividing up of the land of Canaan among the 12 tribes of Israel, and the period of the judges. That period, the judges and Joshua and the judges, may be one of the most difficult and contentious period in the life of Israel. Now we get a repeat of that during the divided kingdom. But some of the most difficult parts of the Old Testament are to be found from that period, Judges and Joshua. A lot of genocide, a lot of destructive wars and violence, not only between the Israelite tribes and the surrounding tribes that lived in the land of Canaan before the Israelites showed up, but
So we're trying to get to a seat that can reach, but I'm flying on anyone.
okay. Where was I?
Conflict.
Pardon?
Conflict.
Yeah, the conflicts between the Israelite tribes and other native tribes of the Canaanite region, but conflict between the tribes of Israel. A lot of tensions about ownership of land, boundaries between the different tribal settlements and so on. It's an era of an awful lot of violence. And often in the imagination and the belief of different people groups within Israel, the violence was orchestrated and determined by God, according to what they understood and believed. And that's where some of the conflict comes with later understandings of the nature of God and the purposes of God. And even the prophets critique. We'll talk about that next time or the time afterwards. Okay. So the conquest of Canaan. Then from about 1050 to 930, at 1050, the kingdom of Israel was established, where the tribes became united, the 12 tribes became united under one monarchy. The people demanded of Samuel, one of the late judges, give us a king. They wanted empire. They wanted power, and they knew that power could only come when the tribes were united. Give us a king, like the other nations. They want to be like the surrounding empires, surrounding nations. Nations is really a more modern term. There were no boundaries, but you had to show a passport to get to the other territories. A lot of migration back and forth among different tribal entities, people groups, the Ammonites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Philistines that had their territory in the land of Canaan and on the other side of the Jordan River. And
Is that where the expression when Israel asked for a king, careful what you ask for? Is that
Exactly.
that expression?
exactly. In fact, I was reviewing some of those passages in Samuel, in 1st and 2nd Samuel yesterday, and Samuel basically said, "Do you know what you're asking for?" Yeah, and they said, "Yeah, we want to have a king." And Samuel says to them, "This is what you're going to get. He's going to take your young men and send them into war. He's going to steal your goods. He's going to enrich himself and impoverish the rest of you, and on and on. Bad stuff." And they said, "We want a king." They wanted their identity to be like the identity of the other peoples around them. And God had called them out of that, in fact, to embody a different kind of social reality. Okay.
What happened to Ishmael up in the,
Oh, that's up in Abraham. Yeah. Ishmael was actually the first legitimate son of Abraham with his concubine. That was very common in the ancient world, that you had a wife or two or three, and you had concubines who were not your wives. But anyway, Leah, the concubine, bore Ishmael. And there came a time when Sarai, who had not had a child, who was barren at that point, demanded that Ishmael and the concubine Leah were ejected. There's a fabulous sculpture by Segal of Abraham embracing his son Ishmael. Leah stands in the shadows, barely recognizable, and Sarai stands there watching her husband Abraham hugging and bidding farewell to his son Ishmael, with tears streaming down his eyes, and she has a very harsh, sinister, angry look on her face.
and we're paying for that disobedience.
And we are still paying. Yes,
I have a question
yes.
about the term Israel. At what point was it no longer the family of Abraham and it became the Israelites? Can you talk about that term? This is English, of course, and we're looking at this with 21st century.
Yeah. I have to go back and find out exactly what that chronology was. Up on the Israelite tribes were, all of them were considered to be Israelites, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When we get to the kingdom period, there's a change that comes. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay? Okay, so we have the United Kingdom for about what? 50, 40 years. 120 years. United Kingdom under the first three kings of Israel: Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul, David, and Solomon. The kingdom was united. Under Solomon, the center of the kingdom became what? Jerusalem. Okay. And the temple that was built there under Solomon. That became the worship center of Israel. And probably many of the Psalms that we have in the Old Testament were written for the worship context in the temple, or sung during the coronation of Israel's kings in procession up to the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. So we have the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. Things began become pretty difficult in the last years of David's reign. His sons did not always agree. There was a lot of conflict. And ultimately, Solomon becomes the successor to David, comes to king. And Solomon's reign was a pretty successful reign, generally speaking, in the history of Israel. They look back to the time of David and his son Solomon as kind of a glory period of Israel's historical existence. Okay. In 930, the kingdom was divided between the north and the south. That's where the split comes. 10 tribes seceded from the kingdom, as it were, chose their own king, Jeroboam, who was a general of David and Solomon, rather more Solomon than David. And a lot of people followed him, and they established what we now know, what from that point on was called Israel. The 10 tribes, except Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin and Judah. Judah had some of the largest land in the southern part of the land of Palestine, of Canaan. Judah here, and there's just a little, Benjamin just had a little piece right here. That became known as Judah. The northern part of the divided kingdom became known as Israel. Okay. They were the majority in some sense. And it was, you can see there are other tribes, the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Aramites, and in the larger region of the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, with Persia over here, which is present-day Iran, Syria up here, and Iraq up in that area. So that's kind of the geography in which the divided kingdom existed. I wanted to say something about, now, yeah, Judah, of course, Jerusalem continues to be the center of worship for Judea in the south, okay? And the Israelites ultimately built their own sanctuary in Shechem. This became known as Samaria in New Testament times, the province between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. So that's kind of the geography. Now, the larger historical context, geographical historical context within which the divided kingdom existed, this is Israel. This is the larger ancient Near Eastern world that impacted upon the life of Israel. Assyria with Nineveh as the capital, Babylon with Babylonia as the capital, and Persia, Susa, the major capital. These empires, waxing and waning, becoming larger and smaller, depending on who was in charge, constantly put pressure on surrounding lands because they always were into empire, increasing their territory, increasing their wealth, increasing their dominance. And it was doing, within that context, that during the years of the divided kingdom, all kinds of alliances were being made by Judah in the south with surrounding tribes and Israel in the north with surrounding tribes in order to hold back the encroachment of the major powers, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. Okay? And those three play a significant part in the language of the prophetic literature, where the prophets were constantly saying to the leaders in Israel, the prophets that addressed Israel in the north and the prophets that addressed Judah in the south. Your alliances that you're making with these powers are contrary to what God is about. Put your trust and your faith in God, not in these inhuman powers of war and violence. Out of that come words like the prophet Isaiah, who said, they shall beat ultimately their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Weapons of war transferred into instruments for life. That was the challenge. But as we even experience today, the quest for power, for empire, for control. It's very much part of humans' social interactions and so on. Okay, so within that 721, so that's about 150 years, 200 years almost, after the divided kingdom begins, that Israel, the northern kingdom, falls to the Assyrians. Remember, the Assyrian Empire was up here. It had expanded. It had encroached down toward Israel. And the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrians. And it was very common in the ancient world when a conquering power occupied and defeated one of its adversaries. Major sectors of the population were sent into exile and dispersed in the Assyrian Empire. Okay? And that's what happened. Historically, we talk about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom. They were dispersed among the nations in the ancient Near East and often acclimated themselves to the religious systems and cultural values and so on of the nations within which they lived. So the northern kingdom was basically wiped off the map. And the other thing that conquering powers did was to take peoples from their lands and settle them in the conquered lands as a way of what? Controlling them, changing their identity. Okay. Then in 586, Judah, the southern kingdom, falls to the Babylonians, who had now become stronger even than the Assyrians and attacked the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin. And the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, wiped off the map. Most of Jerusalem was destroyed. The Babylonians didn't take the entire population and resettle them like the Assyrians did. They took the cream of the crop. Okay, the leaders, the intelligentsia, the priesthood, and resettled them in captivity in Babylonia and the surrounding environment of the city of the capital city of Babylon. That exile, and that when the Old Testament talks about the exile, when the prophets talk about the exile, they're talking about the southern kingdom and the cream of the crop being taken into captivity in Babylon. Exile is never a reference to what happened to the northern kingdom and to the people there. I mean, they were dispersed, they were exiled. And in fact, in the time of the New Testament, there were more Jewish people and descendants of those folks living in the great Mediterranean world than they were living in Jerusalem and in Judea, Samaria, Galilee in the time of Jesus. And that's why when Paul did his missionary work, he always began where? Synagogue. Synagogue in Ephesus, synagogue in Thessalonica, synagogue in Greece, in Athens, and in Corinth, and even in Rome. Though Paul didn't do any missionary work there, but he got there with his hands and feet bound.
Did Assyria destroy, is it Shechem? Shechem?
Shechem.
Similarly, do you know?
It wasn't as important. It wasn't a glorious temple.
No,
like
that's what
Jerusalem.
I'm.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a good question. I have to check that one out.
So when I was studying Western civilization in college, they said that the professor was big on that theory that the Bible didn't really get written until the Babylonian captivity. And I didn't know if I agreed with that, but I put it on the test. And then later I was reading something that says that no, if you take the first 5 books of the Bible stylistically, they're so much different than the rest that probably wasn't during the captivity, or they probably had those around already.
Yeah.
So where is the scholarship on that right now?
Both ends. I'm going to get to that. There's a section on that toward the end of today. Okay. Okay. Exile in Babylon for this period, about 50 years. And then in 539, Persia, Assyria is up here, Babylon is here, Persia is over here. Persia becomes the empire. Okay? And under Cyrus, the Persian monarch, the Persian king, the exiles in Babylon are allowed and encouraged, and sometimes financially supported, to come back to the land of Israel, to come back to the land, to come back out of exile. Okay? That happened in 538. From 539 to 538, Babylon is conquered by Persia. Cyrus of Persia allows Jews to return to their land. One of the things that's important to also to recognize is that during exile, especially exile in Babylon, there was no temple. There was no possibility to carry on the Jewish sacrificial cult. Okay? Guess what happened? That's the origin of the synagogue. The focus came to be not on the sacrificial system, but on Torah, on law. And that is the beginning of the Jewish, what should I call it? The priesthood was there, but it could not be active until the temple was rebuilt during the reconstruction period under Cyrus. But by that time, the memory of the law of Moses, of Torah, became equally or stronger than the focus on sacrificial ritual. The temple was rebuilt during this reconstruction period between 580, 538, and 516. Jerusalem was restored and the temple was rebuilt. Judah, during that period, was under Persian sovereignty. Okay, the Persians were in charge, but relatively autonomous. The Persians did not interfere with local traditional Jewish beliefs and practices. In fact, Isaiah, when he talks about the Persian king allowing Cyrus, allowing Israelites to come back and to rebuild the city and the temple, Isaiah talks about Cyrus as the servant of Yahweh, the servant of God. Interesting. The same term that is used in other places in Isaiah for Israel as a whole, the servant people, and for the promised future deliverer, the Messiah, was also called the Ebed Yahweh, the servant of God. And so this is what we have in this period, Judah under Persian sovereignty. The leading figures during that time were Zerubbabel, who was a political ruler, Nehemiah. In fact, Nehemiah came from Babylon, from exile, twice returned to Babylon, came back, and was basically the political ruler of a restoration in Israel. He probably most of the credit for what happened in terms of the restoration of Israel happened under Nehemiah. Ezra was a scribe, and probably much of the collection, get back to your question, much of the collection of ancient Israelite tradition that was handed down. The Book of the Law, for example, that was discovered in the archives of the temple during the reign of Josiah, who was one of the few kings who lived his life and reigned in Israel in 1750, somewhere in 750 BC, who again and again is referred to as the king who lived righteously before God and did God's work. Whereas 95% of the other kings, what you read again and again in the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings is, and they did not rule. They were not shepherds like God wanted them to be shepherds of his people. Okay, then in 336, as it happens around the world, Persia is now conquered, the Persian Empire, which contained that entire geographical region that I showed you on the map, that included Assyria and Babylonia. Persia had all of that conquered, that whole region. Alexander the Great from Greece moves east as a conqueror, so Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great, and that begins what is generally called the Hellenistic period. And Hellenistic simply means the Greek period, which then becomes the Greco-Roman period when Rome comes onto the scene. Okay, Hellas, the Hellenistic period, that's because that's the original name of Greece, Hella. Okay, so it's called the Hellenistic period. In 336 to 160, Judah was then ruled, no longer autonomous like under the Persians. Judah was now ruled because Alexander died. Alexander died as a young leader, king, and general on the front. In those days, the rulers led their armies into battle. Okay, they didn't sit themselves and directed their troops. Upon the death of Alexander, shortly after the conquest of Persia, that whole territory was ruled by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the Greeks. The Greek Empire in the Greek Peninsula, Macedonia, parts of what we now know as Turkey, were ruled by a Greek successor of Alexander. The Ptolemies were the Egyptians. There was an Egyptian empire that had developed during that period. And the Seleucids, which were ruled by one of the successors of Alexander. And that was the empire that basically was what we now have today as Syria, north of Palestine, south of Turkey. That region was occupied by this successor of Alexander, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies controlled Israel, Judah, from 331 to 198, and then the Seleucids defeated the Egyptians. Assyria came down, defeated the Egyptians, and were now in control from 198 to 160 by the Seleucids. Antiochus Epiphanes, that's what he called himself, one of the rulers of the Seleucids, the Syrians, called himself God manifest, like the manifestation of God. Like the Caesars later called themselves what? sons of God. In fact, they were considered to be incarnations of the gods, as it were. Under the Seleucids, the Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus manifest, epiphany, we have that word in out of the Greek and Latin. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted forcefully to turn the Jewish people into Hellenists, into Greeks. He wanted to Hellenize the entire arena of the ancient Near East. Greek culture, Greek learning, Greek language, and so on and so forth. Including in that effort to turn the people of Israel into good Greek citizens. He forbade the keeping of the Sabbath. It was a sentence of death if you were caught with a copy of the Torah. Circumcision, which was uniquely, not exclusively, but uniquely in that era, a Jewish ritual, were all forbidden. Well, that didn't sit too well with the Israelites. The crowning coup d'etat, as it were, the crowning attempt by Antiochus Epiphanes to subdue and to change the whole ethos of this conquered people, the Israelites, was to went to the temple and sacrifice a pig on the high altar of the temple in Jerusalem. In the book of Daniel, that is referred to as the abomination of desolation, or the abominable sacrifice. There's nothing that could have stirred up the Israelites as much in opposition to the Seleucids as that act. Because as you know from Leviticus, the pig was understood as probably one of the most unclean animals in the world. To sacrifice that on the high altar of the temple in Jerusalem was just not acceptable. And that led to the beginning in 166 of the Maccabean revolt. Maccabee, son of Hashmon, and the other sons started a grassroots revolt against the Syrians. Jerusalem was conquered in 164, was conquered by the Maccabees, and the temple was cleansed in a national festival of restoration and so on. And that is called the Feast of Hanukkah, which Jews to this day is probably the high and holy feast in every Jewish community. Hanukkah, which is called the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Lights. At one of those occasions, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus comes to Jerusalem at the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, and stands up in the temple on the great 8th day of the festival, which was the climax, and says, "I am the light of the world." The symbol of that festival was huge torches surrounding the walls of Jerusalem and the walls of the temple that gave, according to tradition, gave light to the entire city. And in that Jesus comes, says, "I am the light of the world," and then he talks about himself also being the water of life. And there was a water ritual pouring during that festival also, that symbolized the giving of water during the Exodus in the wilderness. That was also a ritual that was celebrated. Okay, so that's where we are. Palestine under Hasmonean dynasty. From 142 to 63, Palestine was now ruled by the successors of Judas the Maccabean. It's called the Hashmonean, because that was the family name, the Hashmonean dynasty. Approximately 100 years, as you can see. It was not a very nice period. The Hashmonean rulers were often corrupt. They played political football with surrounding nations in order to create alliances, to keep them in power, and so on, to pay possible tribute to other nations that otherwise would have invaded them. And it was during that period, probably the latter part of this period, that we have the emergence of various sectarian groups within Israel who had such high religious and ethical standards that they reacted against the rulers and the priesthood. Under the Hashmoneans, the Hashmonean ruler and the high priest became one. Religion and state merged into one. That has always been a recipe for failure. Always has been. And so, where was I here? Yeah, during that period. And during that period then emerged rival groups who considered the priests in Jerusalem to be corrupt, which they were. You've heard about the Essenes or the Qumran covenant people from whom we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. That group, that sectarian group, that monastic group within Israel emerged during this period. Okay. In their reaction and response against the official leadership, both secular and religious, that they believed to be corrupt. And in fact, in some of the Dead Sea Scroll writings, it becomes very clear. They talk about the wicked priests in Jerusalem in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have that language. That comes out of that period. Then another empire comes on the scene. Okay? The Hellenistic era continues. As somebody has said, the Romans conquered the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean region. And the Greeks conquered language and culture. The language of the Roman Empire during the time of Jesus was what? Greek, the common language. Okay. Rome adopted much of the Greek pantheon, Zeus and his entire cadre of minor gods, and gave them Latin names, basically adopting the same kind of religious ideology. Okay, so the General Pompey in 63, moving north across, west across, east across Turkey from Rome, from the Roman Peninsula, and comes down and conquers Palestine and Jerusalem for Rome. And from that point on, 63, until way beyond the time of Jesus, centuries after Jesus, that whole Mediterranean region was controlled by Rome. Okay? Judaism under Roman rule. Then this is, of course, the period of the, this is 63, let's see, what am I doing here? This is still all BC, of course, yeah. And so from this point on, you have, this is the time of Jesus in here. And in 66 AD, and Jesus in fact predicted it in some of his teaching, he realized the way in which Judaism was moving. And you have the beginning of the Jewish revolt. You had attempts already during the time of Jesus and before by the Zealots, who were revolutionary groups within Israel. The Pharisees and the scribes said, God will bring in his kingdom in God's time. The Zealots weren't satisfied by that. They wanted to help God out. And so they became revolutionaries. And there were all kinds of episodes against the Romans. That's why the Romans on high and holy festival days during the time of Jesus brought in extra cohorts of Roman legions into Jerusalem, into Palestine, to make sure that if there was any kind of possible revolt, they could throttle it right there and suppress it. The beginning of the Jewish revolt against Rome, and 4 years later, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. And once again, there was an exile of the leading population of Jerusalem and surrounding territory in Galilee, Samaria, and Judah were were expelled from their own land and became part of what is called the diaspora, the dispersion of Jews. And there were more people in the diaspora than there were in Palestine. Now, we have just a few minutes left. The content of the Hebrew scriptures. This is what I call Israel's confessional history. Confessional history. It's history. There are major historical blocks in there, but even that history is confessional. It contains the faith of Israel as it develops, as it grows, as it deteriorates, as it revives, going through all those things. Israel's confessional history across 2,000 years. The Old Testament is not a book. The Old Testament is a library of books. The Old Testament reflects a great variety. I don't know why. Does anybody know how?
Don't hit that.
No, we'll leave it.
Go away.
I'll see if I can. I don't know whether I can. No, I
Oh,
can.
there you go.
Hey,
Whatever you, good job.
here it goes. The Old Testament reflects a great variety. Remember that. A great variety of beliefs, experiences, theological convictions, interpretations and understanding of historical events. You have the major historical books are 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Later, we get 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is kind of a parallel to Samuel and Kings, but often understands and interprets events in that history from a different perspective, a later perspective. In some cases, a more mature understanding of God's purpose and God's will and how that played itself out in Israel's history. So interpretations and understandings of historical events, liturgical traditions and practices changed over the course of Israel's history. And that is reflected in the documents that we have. The completed books of the Old Testament are often the end result, and that's partially response to that question. Often the end result of centuries of traditions passed on from one generation to the next by oral traditions. In ancient cultures, oral tradition, where most people were illiterate, was the way in which the tradition and the beliefs were passed on from one generation to the next. Okay? Oral tradition. In fact, those who have studied oral tradition in ancient cultures have discovered that memory in non-literary traditions and context is much, much sharper than ours. Because we can go read it. And now we can go to Google and get all the information we want. None of that, of course, was possible, not that technology, but even memory is finely honed when that is the way in which your identity is affirmed and kept and passed on from one generation to another. So much in the earliest centuries of Israel's existence, from Abraham on, the stories about it that we find in the book of Genesis, for example, were passed on by oral tradition in blocks, in thematic contexts and so on. Court records by royal scribes in the ancient Near East, not only in Israel, but in the surrounding nations and tribes. Royal scribes were tasked with creating court records, decisions by the monarch, policies promoted by them, and so on, decisions that were made. Records by oral scribes, priestly traditions from the Levites. The Levites, Levi, one of the sons of Jacob, became the priestly class, right? They were responsible for passing on and making sure that the sacrificial cult, the sacrificial practices and so on, and laws connected with those were passed on from one generation to the next. Collections of songs, psalms, used over the course of centuries, primarily in worship. Written records of the prophets, oral addresses by their disciples. You know, when Isaiah or Hosea or Amos addressed the powers that be, which they often did, they spoke the truth of God to the powers in Jerusalem or in the north. They didn't sit down in the study and to write the books that we know as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Lamentations and so on. They were recorded and memorized and then written down ultimately by their followers, their disciples. And there were prophets that were rejected by certain segments of the people. Not everybody believed what the prophets were saying, but they had followers like Jesus' own life. That's why Jesus was often called the new prophet in Israel. He had a group of disciples, he taught them. And it was his disciples that wrote down ultimately what he had said in certain situations and certain contexts. And that's why we have variety in some of the gospel stories that are the same stories about the same event, but they are discrepancies that we would call them. But they're not discrepancies, they're simply different ways in which the words of Jesus were heard and recorded and then ultimately written and collected by his followers. Written records of the prophets, oral addresses, wisdom sayings, like proverbs that were handed down by parents to their children within the community. Proverbs. The book of Job is a wisdom book. It deals with the reality of human suffering in relationship to God. Ecclesiastes, interesting. Ecclesiastes is a fascinating book. And sometimes you think, why is he saying this? The prophet said, I saw the word of the Lord, or I heard the word of the Lord. That's how they understood inspiration. The writers of the Proverbs, possibly some of them from David, some of them from Solomon and other leaders in Israel, especially Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, the preacher of the book of Ecclesiastes, he doesn't refer to divine inspiration. He says, I went out and I looked at life and I studied and I observed, and these are the conclusions I reached. We do learn that way, don't we? And we do learn what leads to good and what leads to evil, what unites and what divides. And Ecclesiastes is particularly good at that. Okay. Oops. Scholarly consensus about this collection of writings, the content of the Old Testament, reflecting centuries of Israel's history and faith traditions, was collected, recorded, edited, and codified during primarily 3 periods. The kingship period, we do have records there. And I referred earlier to Josiah, one of the good kings of Israel, about 750. During his time, the book of the law was rediscovered in the dusty archives of the catacombs of the temple. And that led to Josiah's reform on the basis of that recovery. So there were documents, Torah documents that were there. We don't know what they were. A lot of scholars think that that during the kingship period, that book of the law that was found may have been Deuteronomy, or parts of what we now know as the book of Deuteronomy. Traditions of legal teaching passed down from Moses, ultimately put into writing. During the exile in Babylon, we know from internal documents in the Old Testament that a lot of activity took place during the exile in Babylon, where the Israelites looked back at their history and often stood critically over against some of their beliefs in that history because of what it led to. And so during the exile in Babylon, and then during the post-exilic period from 538 to 150 BC. By 150 BC, 150 years before the time of Jesus, what we know as the canon of the Hebrew scriptures, what our Old Testament, was basically accepted as the authoritative Torah. And Torah does not only refer to law, it refers to the entire complex of Israel's religious traditions. And it was also about this time, but from 200 to 150, that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, was translated into the Greek language because the vast majority of Jews who lived in the diaspora no longer spoke or could read Hebrew or even speak Hebrew. I guess I said that's why spoke and speak. Yeah. And so scholars, literary scholars within Judaism, gave themselves to the task of translating the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, into Greek, which is known as the Septuagint, because there's a legend behind that 70 Jewish scholars were all put into different places to translate the Hebrew Bible into the Greek. And when they got finished and they compared them, every single letter was exactly the same in all. That's very much of a legend, because we know a lot of Greek Old Testament documents that don't agree like that. But that was a nice way of saying we affirm this as authoritative side by side with the Hebrew scriptures, which are fundamental.
So the Old Testament that we see today dates back to 150 BC approximately?
Yeah.
It's not been edited again and again and again and again. I'm just asking.
Yeah, there were revisions of the Septuagint.
Okay.
Okay, and there are some differences there. And the Septuagint has some Jewish books that are not in the Hebrew Bible that were written in Greek. Okay, like parts of the book of Daniel, were written in Greek, not in Hebrew. And later were brought together under one roof. Well, I told you, this is bread and butter stuff.
We like bread and butter.
Next week, we're going to get into some fun and stuff that you can really dig into and wrestle with together. Okay? Have a good week.